If your photos come out like this, or like this, then you need exposure bracketing to get all the detail you'll ever need. And even though it might sound complicated, it's actually a really straightforward and easy process once you've done it a few times. And you can do it whether you've got a camera like this or like this. Bracketing is basically a process where your camera takes 3, 5, 7, or maybe 9 photographs, all with slightly different exposure levels. It's also known as HDR or exposure blending, but they all basically mean the same thing. The darker shots will have details in the brightest parts, and then the brighter photos will have details in the shadows. Then when you are editing, most programs can blend them together to give you more detail and less noise in the shadows and highlights. I'll show you how to blend them together a little bit later on in your computer, but first I've got to show you how to take the photographs to get consistent results. It works really well with landscape photography, real estate and architectural photography. Basically anywhere where there's not much movement in the frame and you can keep that camera perfectly still. I even shoot them handheld sometimes, and you can too if your hands are steady enough. But the best way to get a successful blend is to use a tripod. The great thing with bracketing is that in most cameras nowadays, it's built in as a function. You just have to hunt around in those menus a little bit. In the Sony camera, all you need to do is go to the drive mode, which is left on the D-pad on the back of the camera, and then press down 4 or 5 times. If you shoot with a Canon camera, find Exposure Comp stroke AEB in the menus and set the different exposures there. In Nikon cameras, look for Auto Bracketing Set and then select AE Bracketing. In the Fuji cameras, it's in the drive setting. Again, back to the Sony camera, all you need to do is look for this function, BRKC or BRKS. S is for single shots, where you have to press the shutter button for each shot in the sequence. And C is for continuous, where you can either hold your finger down to rapidly fire through each one, or if you turn on the self-timer in bracket settings, this will do them all automatically with one press of that shutter button. To find the self-timer in the Sony camera, all you need to look for is bracket settings. It's different in the old menu, but in the new menu, you just go to this camera tab, drive mode, and bracket settings. So I'll set self-timer during bracket to 2 seconds. So now when I bracket my shots, when I take a shot, it sets a 2-second timer and then takes 3 shots all in one hit with that one button press. So there's the brightest one, the medium one and the darkest one. Then I'll change my bracketing order to the darkest, the normal, and then the brightest. This just means they're easier to spot on the timeline along the bottom of the editing program that you use. In most cameras, you can also change how big you want the gap to be with exposure ranges between the shots, and also how many shots you want in the sequence. Now in my camera, if I go to that bracketing function, the first number is the exposure value difference between each of the shots, and the second number is how many photos are going to be in the sequence. With the Sony cameras, you can have up to 3 stops of a gap between each shot and 5 frames. You can have 1 stop gaps with 9 frames, 5 frames, 3 frames, 0.7 of a stop, 0.5 of a stop, or 0.3 of a stop. I either shoot with 1.0 EV3 or 1.0 EV5. So 3 or 5 shots in the sequence with a 1 stop exposure difference between each of those shots. Now there are subtle differences between all of the different brands. I shoot with Sony, but if you shoot with Canon, Nikon or Fuji, just have a search online how to do bracketing with your brand and with the model that you shoot with. When you're in aperture priority mode and you turn on bracketing, it'll change the shutter speed. So if we look back at those, we've got one at 1/100th of a second, one at 1/200th of a second, and one at 1/400th of a second. When you're in shutter priority, it will change the aperture. So if we look at those, you can see 1/320th of a second, f6.3, f9, and f13. If you're in manual mode with manual ISO, it'll change the shutter speed once again. So again, if we look back at those, I've got 1/160th, 1/320th, and 1/640th. However, if I change my ISO to auto, so we've got ISO auto now, when I take the shot, ISO will change. ISO 320, ISO 160, ISO 100. I find it best to keep it in manual mode with manual ISO or aperture priority, so the camera is only changing the shutter speed. If you're in shutter priority and the camera changes the aperture through the sequence, this will change the depth of field. And this is basically how much is in focus from front to back. You want this to be consistent from the first shot to the last shot. With auto ISO, this just changes the gain of the photo. So basically there'll be no more or less light coming into the camera between shots. This will be just like duplicating the same shot and then changing the exposure slider in Lightroom. There's no more or less light coming into the camera for each of the photographs. So if you are new to this, just keep it in aperture priority or manual mode with manual ISO so it changes the shutter speed. This will just keep it simple and you'll avoid any complications when you're trying to blend them together. Also, whilst I'm talking about settings that might change, make sure your white balance is set to one of the presets. This is so it stays the same between each frame. I keep it set to daylight so I know that every single shot in the sequence will have exactly the same white balance level. The next step is to take the photos. So get your camera stable on your tripod, frame up the shot, focus, and then take the bracketed sequence. There are also two other ways that you can shoot your bracketed sequences. If you set the camera to aperture priority, when you have a good exposure, use the exposure compensation dial and turn it to -1. Okay, that's on -1, and I'll take a shot. Turn it to 0, take a shot, and then turn it to +1 and take a shot. If you want to do 5 shots, start at -2, then -1, 0, +1, and +2. The other way is to put your camera in manual mode and set it up so your exposure looks good on the back of the camera. You might do this by using the histograms, the zebras, or the meter on the back of the camera. For the example I'm going to give you, I'm just going to use the meter on the back of the camera and set it to 0. So in manual mode, what I'll do is change the shutter speed to 1/320th and then take a shot. Then I'll take it down to 1/160th, take a shot. And then I'll change it again to half of that, so 1/80th of a second, and then I'll take another shot. These 3 ways will give you exactly the same results. It's just that the bracketing setting is a little bit more automated and you can set it up so it'll automatically take the shots how you want them. Now there might be times when you're not sure how to get a good exposure for the scene in front of you. So you might be hiking and look at a scene that you really like, but you're not sure whether to expose for the highlights, for the shadows, or what to expose for. If this is the case, just turn on bracketing. Like for instance, the scene I've got in front of me, the sky is starting to get really bright, but the landscape is still a little bit dark. What I tend to do is put it on a 1-stop difference between shots and then 5 shots. So I'll go to that now, and I'll switch it to 5, and then I'll take a shot of this scene in front of me. So with that scene in front of me, it's taken a shot at 1/100th of a second, 1/200th of a second, 1/400th of a second, 1/800th of a second, and 1/1600th of a second as well. So I've got 5 different shots that I can choose from later on when editing. This does take up a bit more space on your hard drive. It can make you a lazy photographer, but it will open up those options when you are editing on your computer. Now, if you do this, try not to make it too much of a habit. And when you get those photos back on your computer, try and see which one gave you the good exposure or the one that you liked. Was it underexposed? Was it the middle exposure? Or was it slightly overexposed? Whichever one it was, remember that. And then the next time you're out in the field taking a similar photograph, just try and get it in one shot. And this will teach you so much about you and your photography. Now, the next thing to get your head around is whether or not the shot needs bracketing in the first place, because some do, but others really don't. The way I work is to look at the histogram. If it looks like a half pipe where it's touching either side of the bar graph, this is when I will bracket. But if it looks like a mountain peak, or if it's contained within that bar graph without touching the sides, that's when it's good to get it in one shot. Now, when I do real estate shoots, all I need to do is work out whether there's a window in the shot or not. If there's a window in the shot, I'll bracket that shot. If there's not a window in the shot, I won't have to. And this basically comes down to the dynamic range of the shot exceeding the dynamic range of the camera. Again, if you're unsure, bracket to be on the safe side. It's better to have too much data and have to delete images rather than not have enough. When I'm editing, I use Lightroom. If you use a different program, you might have to find out how to blend your bracketed shots or whether the program can do it or not. Some can and some can't. In Lightroom, find the images along the film strip. Select all of the images in the bracket, then right-click on them, and then Photo Merge, HDR. In the pop-up box, you'll have a few options. I'll check Auto Align, I'll have Auto Settings unchecked, and then with the deghost amount, this is all down to personal preference. But this just gets rid of any ghosting you might have when something moves from one photo to the next in the sequence. And by ghosting, I mean it looks like those fake ghost photos where a person or something is see-through because when it's taken the first shot, it's in one position, and when it takes the second shot, that thing is in another position. This is what deghosting gets rid of. If you do select deghosting, just turn on Show Deghost Overlay so you can see what it's changing. Then click Merge. Again, if you do have this ghosting on, remember where those ghosting areas were and just check that in the final image. Once processed, it'll produce a completely new image, and this will have a bigger dynamic range than if you would have just taken the scene in one shot. When you're editing these blending shots, it's easy to take it a bit too far and make it look unnatural, so just be careful with those sliders. Remember, subtlety is the key to editing. Now you know how to get a good exposure even when those conditions are harsh. But what makes you decide what you put in the photograph, and more importantly, what you cut out? Well, this has a little bit to do with knowing where to stand and what focal length to use. Now, there is a little bit more to it than that, and in this video I go over everything that you need to know to get really compelling photographs. I'll see you next time.